Conversations with Nurses, a podcast where we chat with nurses from all walks of life. I'm Paula Holland. Join me as I take you into an inside look into the nursing profession, where we explore the human side of healthcare and gain insight into the dedication and compassion that drive nurses to care for others. So grab your headphones and come along for the ride as we dive on in on Conversations with Nurses. Hey, welcome to Conversations with Nurses. Tonight, I would like to introduce you to Paul-Forden, the CEO of South Metro Health in Perth. Welcome, Paul.
Hi.
You're CEO of South Metro Health, which is a whole group of hospitals south of the river, the best part of Perth.
Absolutely the best part of Perth. I hoped also the best hospitals, but my colleagues would probably dispute it, but I hold firm on that.
Yeah. In which hospitals are you looking after?
So currently it's Fiona Stanley, which is the largest public hospital in West Australia.
Mm-hmm.
So that opened about 8 years ago. And that is an amalgamation really of activity from a number of existing hospitals, but none of those close. So it's quite unusual to do it that way. Fremantle, which is over 100 years old now, I think it's 125 years. So obviously that's a long-standing hospital within West Australia, probably one of the oldest again.
Mm-hmm.
We also have Rockingham Hospital, so going further south down the freeway to Rockingham. Further south to there, we've got a very small hospital called Murray District. And then finally under my remit, but run by Ramsay at the moment until next year, is Peel Health Campus.
So Ramsay, you've got a good group of hospitals as well.
So Ramsay have a group, but the Peel Hospital, which is Mandurah-based, is one they run on behalf of government. So they've run that for a number of years. They've run it well. But we're taking that back in public hands next year.
And considering this is a Conversations with Nurses and you're not a nurse, are you?
No, you wouldn't put me near a patient.
Oh.
I'm not a clinician of any sort. I'm a grey-suited accountant by trade.
So you don't wear a nurse's outfit on Saturday night?
Never. Not even for a fancy dress party.
No, I don't suppose you would. So how many nurses would you say you'd have under you? Or that you would be
responsible for?
Yes.
Probably maybe 7,500 maybe. I never count the numbers, but we've got a total workforce of about 11,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
That's one in every 150 West Australians just for South Metro. So
wow.
Probably about 7,500 nurses.
That's a lot of nurses, isn't it?
It's a lot of nurses.
And we've had a bit of negative media coverage lately saying that they've been going on strikes, but you don't find that, do you?
Well, clearly there was industrial action earlier in the year, and I won't comment on those reasons. Not all of them took industrial action, and we kept our hospitals running, which is the main thing as far as I'm concerned, because patients need care.
Well, they do, yeah. And I don't think nurses would really leave the patients in the lurch as they implied.
No.
But they do have a need to voice their concerns, don't they?
I've always believed everybody has the right to voice their concerns as a worker, and this is why we moved away from the bad old days in the 1800s and the rich cotton merchants, etc. So very, very strong believer in individual workers' rights. But equally, I have to balance that, obviously, with trying to make sure that our 750,000 patients a year are looked after.
It's a busy hospital, Fiona Stanley alone, isn't it?
So Fiona Stanley is, let's say, it's the biggest hospital in West Australia, probably one of the top 5 biggest in Australia. It's got the second busiest or sometimes the busiest emergency department. It does the statewide heart and lung transfers. It's the statewide burn centre. It does some of the most complex births. It has a big NICU. It has the biggest ICU. So yeah, busy place. But it's really important. It's supported by the other hospitals and they all work together. So no longer can you work as a standalone in health.
So describe what you mean by that.
So what I mean by that is some of the patients might be admitted via the emergency department, if you understand, but maybe their care is better provided in Fremantle, so they'll transfer between the two campuses. Sometimes it will take patients from Rockingham because they need maybe some complex surgery, but then the patients live in the Rockingham area, so we'll then transfer them back to Rockingham so they can be supported. And the same goes with Peel, the same goes with Murray, and the same goes with our community services, to be honest. That's another service we provide. So all the hospitals have to work in an integrated way as campuses, as part of the same organisation. I think they do it really well.
So having 7,000 nurses or thereabouts, have you got enough nurses? Because they always say there's a shortage of nurses.
Look, I think that you'll never have enough staff. But equally, if you look at what we spend on healthcare in Australia, which is pretty average for most developed countries, you could almost double it and then you're at the level of the USA. And it doesn't necessarily buy you more healthcare or better healthcare. So I think what's happened, though, for me is COVID is almost like a spaceship that sucked a whole lot of workers off the planet, whether it's healthcare or hospitality or mining or education. A number of people decided to retire earlier than they potentially were going to. They realized the value of life. I think those in middle years and maybe said, I want to spend more time at home, etc., or more holidays.
Yeah.
I think the younger ones are saying, maybe I don't want to just work so hard. I don't want to do a 60-hour week to earn money. I want to kind of have a right balance. So even if you haven't got enough staff, I don't think the answer is to necessarily be able to recruit more because they don't exist. So I think what we have to do is imagine a new business as usual, whereby some of the bureaucracy we have to review and say, is there a way we can take that out? And maybe that's a good thing for everybody to do.
Yeah, so enhancement and retention of nurses is quite important on your agenda.
Absolutely critical.
Yeah.
Absolutely critical because I said that in the old days, we'd go and put an advert ad and recruit more nurses or more doctors or more allied health, and they don't exist.
And the nurses need obviously some quite specialty services or qualifications to work in those specialty areas that you were talking about. So heart, lung transplants.
Yeah.
Do they learn on the job or is it something that they have to go and do degrees or diplomas post-grad?
So there are a number of post-grad courses they can undertake for ICU, for theatre work, for other areas of specialist interest. Some of the specialist areas you can learn by experience, but absolutely you just can't walk into them unless you've worked in them. You cannot walk into a heart transplant with a full theatre and all that complexity without the experience.
Exactly. Yeah. And it wouldn't be nice to put the nurses into that situation either, where they've I've been thrown into theatre where you have to go and scrub for this transplant and it's terrifying.
Well, I think one, it's not good for the individual nurse. It probably destroys their confidence and means they'll never actually accept that again. Two, actually, it's not great for the patient. If you have somebody, you know what a theatre team is, a real T team. And so if you have somebody who's inexperienced and needs to be minded, it means the rest of the team are distracted. That's not great for a patient requiring such a complex procedure.
That's right. So in your role, how do you balance all the balls or all the people that you have to be in charge of? Because you're not just in charge of the nurses, are you? You're managing everybody that works in these hospitals.
Gosh, yeah, scary when you say it that way. So,
But it's true. I can't imagine.
Well, maybe I shouldn't say this, but maybe size doesn't matter. So what I mean by that is over a certain number, it doesn't matter how many people you've got. So I've run organizations with 3,000 employees. I've run organizations with, as I said, at the moment, there's somewhere around 11,000. Once I used to run my own private business with only 50 people, and that was the hardest of the lot, managing 50 people. Whereas in the bigger organizations, I'm very fortunate. I've got a director of nursing, I've got a director of clinical services, I've got a finance director, I've got operational executives running the services. That's not to say I don't get involved, but I'm not doing it on my own. And that would be the worst thing for anybody, would be put me in charge of every decision. And to think I'd even be able to do it, because I don't. No one person has the capability. There's never been a book written about how to run a hospital. I tell a lie, there was one. It was called If Disney Ran a Hospital. It's quite an amusing little book. But again, if you read it, you probably would say, don't want to read the book to practice. It's just anecdotes.
Yeah.
But you have to work through people. And that's what I have to do. I have to work through and trust everyone who works for me.
So how do you balance your work and your downtime? Like, do you have a turn-off switch? Do people respect your private time? away from work? Or is it just you're turned on?
Look, people do respect that I've got a phone on 24/7, but they don't abuse it.
Good.
So if I get a call at midnight, it's for a very good reason. And sometimes there is a very good reason I need to be called and told.
Mm-hmm.
I had one call over the weekend from a hospital where there's a very difficult situation. It's really important I was called. It's really important I knew.
Mm-hmm.
But they will only do that if they have to. And I'd rather they do that. But even if I go on holiday, to be honest, I still take my phone. It's still on 24/7. But I tend to filter out that's really super important.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I have to trust people who are in charge when I'm away, which I try to do. Some people say I'm a control freak, but I do try to trust them. And then I leave it with them and I filter out the super important or the things which maybe have got an ongoing history, which they might not be aware of. And the rest of it I have to leave to them.
Mm. I remember you taking a phone call about the pandemic and shutting the theatres and cancelling all the cases.
Mm.
And this was before we really knew what was happening with the pandemic or that it was even in the media.
Mm.
And how did that go? Because that was, like you said, a big life-sucking moment or time where things just flipped upside down and went crazy and nobody knew what was happening and nobody knew whether it was serious or not.
Yeah, I think when the World Health Organization came out and declared it a pandemic, and we saw what was obviously happening in Wuhan in China, I think governments around the world in most developed countries started stepping up their awareness and their resilience planning. The decision to cancel surgery, change services, etc., I didn't take that unilaterally. Clearly, that was the whole of health did that as a collective team.
Yep.
And I think we did it in a sensible way. Although it was clearly the difficult case was communicating to the public why you can't go into an emergency department if you think you're COVID, because somebody naturally thinks they're ill. They naturally assume they can go into an emergency department where, of course, they could be highly infectious.
Mm-hmm. And
whilst they're in that emergency department, it affects several other people. So the very early days of COVID, probably the first year when we had the Alpha strain and the Delta strain, which were quite deadly strains, we had to be hyper careful. I remember even being concerned somebody had been in a lift after somebody else had been in a lift. And now we think, oh, that's crazy. But actually, no, that was really serious. It could have actually been transmitted and caused death.
Yep.
Obviously, when Omicron came along, thankfully, it was a far less full disease. It was more contagious, but less harmful to most people, not to everybody, still a risk.
Right.
And I think that was a relief for all of us because I think WA was almost in a limbo, wasn't it? It was kind of seeing it happening around the world and just, do you remember when we had the backpacker and the whole state closes down and there was a real fear. But I think it was right to have that fear. We've got a number of staff, 11,000, a lot of them have family abroad and they saw the impact of it elsewhere. So I think that brought it home to us. You know, I remember a story of one of our poor nurses. After the second year of COVID, we had reflection days I set up across my services in my hospitals where we planted a tree in each hospital and we had a little ceremony where staff could come and reflect on what had happened in their extended families. And we had one nurse who had given birth to their first child. They were from Nepal. They went back just pre-COVID to Nepal. Their grandparents wanted to keep their young child, it was 3 months old, 4 months old, I think, to show their extended family.
Yeah.
The parents flew back to Western Australia. COVID happened, the borders shut, the child couldn't get back.
Oh.
And those stories kind of really stick with you and you realize the impact just wasn't WA. It was our people with their extensions elsewhere.
Yeah. And see, once the government get all the information, then it must filter around to all the hospitals and the people in charge like yourself. Then how do you get that to filter down to all people on the deck? You know, the people who are going to clean those lifts, the people who are distributing food to the patients that are in the hospital, the people